June 26th, 1943, England. The morning began like so many others for the men of the 56th Fighter Group. Cold mist rolling across the airfield, the smell of oil and gasoline hanging in the air, and the sound of Pratt and Whitney engines warming up in the distance. The war in Europe was at full strength now. Every day the skies over occupied France turned into killing grounds. Metal, smoke, and fire twisting together above the clouds. That morning, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, only 22 years old, climbed into the cockpit of his Republic P-47C Thunderbolt, a massive machine that many pilots still didn't fully trust. It was heavier than most fighters of its day, huge compared to the sleek British Spitfires or German Messerschmitts. The P-47 wasn't elegant, it wasn't nimble, but it was powerful, brutally powerful, and today that strength was about to be tested like never before. Johnson's squadron had been assigned to escort B-17 flying fortresses deep into France. These bombers carried destruction for the German war machine, factories, rail yards, refineries, and they needed constant protection from enemy fighters. The Luftwaffe still ruled the air with skill and experience, and every mission risked becoming a one-way flight. The Thunderbolts took off in formation, engines roaring in unison, climbing through low clouds into sunlight. Below them, the English countryside disappeared under a blanket of fog. Ahead, across the channel, waited the French coast, enemy territory. Inside Johnson's cockpit, the vibration of the radial engine was constant. The oxygen mask pressed tight against his face. The smell of rubber and sweat filled his senses. His gloved hand rested on the throttle, eyes sweeping over the gauges. Fuel, oil pressure, manifold pressure, everything in the green. The squadron climbed higher, reaching 25,000 feet. The radio crackled, clipped voices, call signs, the occasional joke to cut the tension. But everyone knew that any second they could run into German fighters. Over northern France, the bombers began their run. Johnson and his wingmen scanned the horizon for movement. The contrails of the B-17s stretched like long white scars across the sky. Then, out of the glare of the sun, shadows appeared, dozens of them. Focke-Wulf 190s, fast, deadly, and flown by some of the most skilled pilots in the Luftwaffe. They came in high and head-on, guns flashing, cutting straight through the bomber formation. The radio exploded with noise. Bandits, 11 o'clock high. Break left, break left. Johnson rolled his Thunderbolt hard, feeling the G-forces press him into the seat. The sky filled with chaos, tracers, black flak bursts, aircraft diving and climbing. He fired short bursts at a passing 190, but it slipped away. Moments later, Johnson's world changed. He was suddenly alone, separated from his squadron, surrounded by empty sky. Then a flash of silver ahead, a 190 coming straight at him. He squeezed the trigger, guns roaring. The two aircraft closed the distance in seconds. Johnson's bullet struck home. The German broke away, trailing smoke. But before Johnson could celebrate, another 190 swooped in from behind. The first shells tore into the Thunderbolt's tail. The aircraft shuddered violently. The canopy filled with the sharp smell of burning oil. Johnson fought the controls. The stick felt heavy, sluggish. He tried to dive, to shake the attacker off. Then came another burst. A string of 20mm cannon shells ripped through the fuselage. Metal screamed. The armor behind his seat sparked as it absorbed the impact. One shell exploded near his cockpit, fragments slicing into his legs and arms. Blood soaked his flight suit. He tried to radio for help, but the set was dead. Silence. The German stayed behind him, hammering away at the crippled P-47. Johnson's instruments shattered one by one. The canopy glass was spiderwebbed with cracks. The oxygen line was cut. At 20,000 feet, he was flying a dead machine. But the Thunderbolt refused to die. The big radial engine, smoking, leaking oil, coughing, still turned. The wings, torn and riddled with holes, still held together. Johnson pulled the stick, trying to level out. The aircraft responded.
Barely. He could hear cannon shells exploding behind his seat. The armor plate saved him again and again. Another burst hit the cockpit, blowing away the canopy entirely. The rushing wind roared like a hurricane. Johnson was drenched in oil, half blinded, blood dripping from his face. He could see the German pilot now, closing in for the kill. The Focke-Wulf pulled alongside, matching his speed. Johnson braced himself for the final burst, but instead of firing, the German pilot simply looked at him. For a moment, two men, enemies, stared across a few feet of air, one trying to survive, the other realizing his opponent was already beaten. Then, astonishingly, the German rocked his wings, a pilot's salute, and peeled away into the clouds.
Johnson was stunned. His Thunderbolt was shredded. 21 cannon hits, more than 200 machine gun holes, control cables nearly severed, and yet it still flew. He nursed the aircraft across the channel, every mile a battle. The engine coughed and sputtered, the propeller nearly seizing. At last, the English coastline came into view. He aimed for the nearest airfield, a fighter strip in southern England, and somehow, impossibly, brought the crippled P-47 down in a crash landing. When ground crews reached him, they couldn't believe what they saw. The plane was barely intact, torn open from nose to tail, riddled like a sieve. One mechanic counted the holes, over 200. They said no other fighter on Earth could have survived it. Robert Johnson climbed out, shaking, bloodied, exhausted, but alive. That day would become legend. The day one man proved what the P-47 Thunderbolt could endure. When Johnson climbed down from his shattered P-47, oil dripping from the wings, the ground crew went silent. Nobody spoke at first. They just stared. The mechanics who rushed to the plane stopped in disbelief, circling the machine like men inspecting a ghost. The fuselage was torn open. Entire panels were gone. The tail section was so full of holes you could see daylight straight through it. The propeller was nicked and bent, the radio gone, the cockpit ripped apart. One of the crewmen muttered, "No way that thing flew across the channel." But it had. Somehow it had. They helped Johnson down, his uniform soaked with oil and blood. His legs trembled as his boots hit the ground. He tried to make a joke, something about a little rough landing, but his voice cracked from exhaustion. When he looked back at his plane, he realized the truth. He shouldn't have made it. No pilot should have. Word spread across the base like wildfire. By evening, officers and pilots from other squadrons had come to see the Thunderbolt that refused to die. Some ran their hands along the holes in the fuselage, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others snapped photographs, knowing they were looking at living proof that the P-47 wasn't just another fighter, it was a survivor. At the time, the Thunderbolt had a complicated reputation. Many pilots had mocked it when it first arrived. They called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, and not always affectionately. Compared to the nimble Spitfire or the sleek Mustang, the P-47 looked bulky, too big, too heavy, too slow to turn. But after that day, Jug took on a new meaning. It wasn't an insult anymore. It was a badge of honor. Johnson's flight became a symbol for the entire 56th Fighter Group, a moment when myth became fact. The Thunderbolt could take punishment that would destroy any other plane and still bring its pilot home. In the weeks that followed, Johnson returned to flying. His wounds healed, his confidence grew. Every time he climbed into the cockpit of a P-47, he knew, deep in his bones, that it would protect him. That belief spread through the squadron. Soon, every pilot at Boxted Airfield, where the 56th was stationed, began to trust their jugs the same way. By mid-1943, the results spoke for themselves. The 56th Fighter Group became one of the deadliest units in the European theater. 17 of its pilots became aces. 3 became double aces. Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, one of the group's fiercest flyers, scored 28 confirmed kills, all in Thunderbolts. Robert Johnson himself reached 27. Major David Schilling, another legend of the 56th, brought down 22 enemy aircraft, all of it in the same machine critics had once dismissed. The numbers were undeniable. Of the 15,683 Thunderbolts built, about 5,200 were lost to all causes, including combat and accidents. A small number considering how many flew and how many missions they survived. The P-47's combat loss rate per mission was just 0.7%, one of the lowest of any Allied fighter. And its kill-to-loss ratio? 4.6 to 1. That made it more effective in some theaters than even the sleek, famous P-51 Mustang. But the public didn't see that. The Mustang looked fast, standing still, elegant, aerodynamic, with its liquid-cooled Merlin engine humming like a racing car. The Thunderbolt looked like a flying milk jug. Bulky, wide-nosed, almost comical beside the Mustang's grace. The press loved the P-51. The photographers loved it. Hollywood loved it. The Thunderbolt remained in the shadows, respected by the men who flew it, but largely forgotten by everyone else. Yet among those pilots, there was no question which aircraft they trusted with their lives. When Johnson returned home to the United States in 1944, after 91 combat missions and 27 aerial victories, he carried with him not only medals, the Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medals, and a Purple Heart, but also the story of a machine that had defied death. He married his high school sweetheart, Barbara, raised 4 children, and left the military behind. He worked in insurance, quietly, without seeking fame, but he never forgot that day, June 26, 1943, the day a battered Thunderbolt carried him home through hell and gunfire and sky. For decades, people repeated the story of how Johnson had been attacked by Egon Meyer, one of Germany's top aces. Meyer had more than 100 victories, the first Luftwaffe pilot to reach that milestone entirely on the Western Front. According to legend, Meyer had been the one who riddled Johnson's Thunderbolt with cannon fire, only to salute him when he refused to go down. It was a good story, dramatic, heroic, and for years people believed it. Johnson himself believed it. Some accounts even claimed that after the war, he contacted Meyer's family to express respect for their father's skill and honor. But history later revealed something else. Records from the Luftwaffe archives showed that Egon Meyer hadn't flown that day. He had transferred commands and wasn't anywhere near the region. His unit wasn't involved in the mission. The attack on Johnson likely came from another German pilot, an unknown ace flying with Jagdgeschwader 26, the second group of Fighter Wing 26. His identity was never discovered. The man who saluted Johnson before flying away remains nameless, a phantom of the sky, immortalized not by name, but by the moment he chose mercy over victory. Meyer himself,
would later die in combat on March 2nd, 1944.
Near Montmédy, France.
Shot down, ironically, by a Thunderbolt pilot, Lieutenant Walter Gresham of the 358th Fighter Squadron. Mayer was just 26 years old, and so the legend came full circle. The Thunderbolt that Mayer supposedly destroyed instead survived, and when he was finally brought down, it was a Thunderbolt that did it.
By late 1944, the P-47's role in the war began to evolve. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang, with its longer range, meant that bomber escort duties gradually shifted away from the Thunderbolt. But the P-47 didn't fade into obscurity. It adapted. What it lacked in endurance, it made up for in sheer destructive power. Armed with 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns and capable of carrying 2,500 pounds of bombs or 10 5-inch rockets, the Thunderbolt became one of the most feared ground attack aircraft of the war. From D-Day, June 6, 1944, to Victory in Europe Day, May 8, 1945, Thunderbolts flew thousands of missions across France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany. They hunted trains, convoys, bridges, and airfields. They destroyed 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, 68,000 trucks, over 6,000 armored vehicles, and countless other targets. German soldiers gave them a name: Jabos, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bombers. When Jabos appeared overhead, German troops dived for cover. The roar of a Thunderbolt meant death from the sky. The 0.50 caliber rounds could shred a truck column in seconds. Rockets and bombs turned fortifications into rubble. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin, could do little to stop them. But the cost was high. Low-level attacks meant flying through intense flak. Anti-aircraft fire tore through the air at treetop level. Many Thunderbolt pilots were lost in those months, shot down over enemy territory. But even then, the aircraft's toughness gave its pilots a fighting chance. Many limped back with engines coughing, wings shredded, and control cables shot to pieces, yet still in one piece. It wasn't glamorous work. No ace scores, no dogfights over the clouds, just the relentless grind of destruction. Rail lines, fuel depots, supply convoys, the slow suffocation of the German war machine. But that's what won the war. By the end of 1945, the German army was starving for fuel, short on ammunition, crippled by broken logistics. And much of that devastation came from the jugs that ruled the low skies of Europe. Even after the war, the Thunderbolt's legacy lived on. Many nations bought surplus P-47s, from Brazil and Peru to Iran, Turkey, and France. Some flew well into the 1950s, even early 1960s in South America. The design philosophy of the Thunderbolt lived on too. Republic Aviation, its builder, later designed the F-84 Thunderjet, then the F-105 Thunderchief, and decades later, that same spirit of toughness and firepower would echo again in the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, a jet built with the same idea in mind: survive, hit hard, and bring your pilot home. The Thunderbolt proved that there was more than one way to rule the sky. You didn't need elegance or beauty, just strength, skill, and trust between man and machine. Robert Johnson, Francis Pobreski, David Schilling, and hundreds of others proved that day after day. They didn't just fly the jug, they believed in it. And that belief, more than anything else, is what made it legendary. They flew the jug, they trusted the jug, and the jug brought them home. Time passes, engines stop, the men grow old. But the stories, the ones written in smoke, steel, and courage, never fade.
Decades after that June morning in 1943, a visitor walking through the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, might stop in front of a gleaming silver P-47 Thunderbolt. The placard beside it lists its model, the D variant, its specifications, its production numbers. 15,680.
3 built 8 50 caliber machine guns, a maximum bomb load of 2,500 pounds. It's a museum piece now, clean and polished, surrounded by silence. Children pass by. Veterans pause, stare, and fall quiet. What the placard doesn't say, what no line of text could ever capture, is why this machine mattered. It doesn't tell you about the nights when a 19-year-old crew chief worked under freezing rain, keeping the engine alive so another pilot could fly at dawn. It doesn't tell you about the men who looked down at Europe from 8,000 feet, watching flak explode around them, knowing that a single hit might mean the end. It doesn't tell you about the day a pilot named Robert Johnson limped home across the channel in a shredded, bleeding Thunderbolt and proved to the world that this aircraft was more than metal. It was a promise that no matter how bad the odds, how hopeless the fight, something built by human hands could still bring a man home alive. That's the legacy of the Thunderbolt. Not the numbers, not the kill ratios, but the bond between man and machine, forged in fire, tested in war. Long after the last jug landed, the lessons remained. That toughness matters more than elegance. That survival is its own form of victory. That true power comes not from perfection, but persistence. When engineers at Republic Aviation designed the A-10 Warthog decades later, the plane that soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq would one day call their guardian angel, they named it officially the A-10 Thunderbolt II. It wasn't nostalgia, it was continuity, the spirit of the Jug reborn in titanium and jet engines. The same wide stance, the same philosophy. Hit hard, take a beating, never leave your pilot behind. The Thunderbolt taught those lessons first, high above the gray clouds of Europe when the world itself hung in the balance. And though time moves on, that roar, that deep, thunderous growl of a Pratt Whitney R2800 still echoes in history. It's the sound of defiance, of a machine that refused to die. Because sometimes, survival is victory. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. You just spent time inside a story that deserves to be remembered, not for its glamour, but for its grit. If this story of the Thunderbolt moved you, help us keep it alive. Like this video. It helps more people find these lost stories of courage. Subscribe if you want to join us on the front lines of history, where every aircraft, every crew, and every forgotten name has a story worth telling. And in the comments below, tell us where you're watching from. Our community stretches from air bases in Texas to classrooms in Tokyo, from historians to veterans, from the curious to the passionate. You're all part of this mission to make sure the past doesn't fade into silence. And when you're ready to keep exploring, click one of the videos on your screen right now. Discover how another aircraft, another crew, another impossible mission changed the course of World War II. Because this story, the story of men and machines, is far from over.